Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The sun was setting over the city of Chicago, casting orange shadows across the skyscrapers and busy streets. Jackson Miller, 34, an FBI agent for 10 years, was coming off a delicate mission that had required all his vigilance and composure. His career was impeccable, and he was known for solving complex cases that seemed impossible. As he drove home through a quiet residential neighborhood, a patrol car abruptly stopped in front of him. The officer behind the wheel, 42-year-old Thomas Whitman, was a hard-eyed, arrogant man known for his impulsive temper and racial prejudice. Without even checking Jackson's identity, Whitman got out of his vehicle, pointed his finger, and accused him of suspicion of theft in the neighborhood. Jackson slowly raised his hands, remaining calm. "I'm an FBI agent, sir." "Here's my badge," he said, pointing at his badge precisely. Whitman looked at him contemptuously. "Stop being a smart aleck," he growled. "You look like someone we're looking for." Passers-by stopped to watch. Some picked up their phones, others whispered to each other. No one dared to intervene. Jackson knew this moment would be a test. It wasn't just about defending his identity, but about resisting an injustice motivated purely by the color of his skin. As Whitman opened his car door to let him in, Jackson felt the injustice weigh heavily on his shoulders. But he knew one thing: no matter what came next, he would not let racism and the abuse of power win. This humiliating arrest would set off a chain of events that would hold the entire system accountable. Jackson Miller stood on the sidewalk, his black coat slightly wrinkled by the cool evening wind. Thomas Whitman's patrol car had blocked his path, and the officer stepped out abruptly, his boots slapping on the asphalt. His cold eyes scrutinized Jackson suspiciously, but there was no doubt about his intentions. He was there to intimidate. "What are you doing here, sir?" Whitman asked sharply, almost threateningly. Jackson remained calm, his posture aligned with his FBI training. "My name is Jackson Miller. I'm a federal agent." "Here's my badge," he said, holding it at chest height under the flickering light of a street lamp. Whitman burst out into a dry, ironic, and cruel laugh. "Federal agent? Are you kidding me? You sound like just another local kid who thinks he can walk around with impunity." Intrigued passers-by stopped a few meters away, some discreetly filming the scene with their phones. Jackson sensed their curiosity, but he had to remain in control of the situation. One bad word or a sudden gesture and Whitman would have found an excuse to stop him. "Listen, Mr. Whitman," Jackson said firmly. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just going home. You're violating my rights." Whitman frowned, his jaw clenched. "I'm doing my job, and you'd better cooperate. Get in the car." Jackson shook his head slightly, but his voice remained calm and controlled. "You don't understand. You're arresting an FBI agent. I'm not a criminal." Whitman looked at him with a defiant glint in his eyes. To him, Jackson's skin color had already doomed him before the truth was even told. "Don't tell me lies, kid. You'll learn the cost of defying local law." There was silence for a few seconds, broken only by the sound of cars and the murmurs of passers-by. Jackson knew this was a critical moment. His career, his dignity, and even his safety were at stake. Yet, beneath the apparent calm, his mind was already working on the best way to handle Whitman, because he knew every detail mattered. The tension was palpable. Every step Whitman took toward him seemed to measure his determination to prove his authority. Jackson, motionless but attentive, prepared for a confrontation that would mark his life forever. Whitman stepped forward, his hard, uncompromising gaze fixed on Jackson. "Get in the car," he ordered, as if challenging his authority were a crime in itself. Jackson hesitated for a split second, aware that every movement was being watched by passers-by and that the slightest false move could be interpreted as a provocation. "I showed you my badge," Jackson said calmly. "I'm an FBI agent. You have no authority to arrest me." Whitman burst out into a dry laugh that echoed through the silent street. "An FBI agent, huh? So what? This is my city, these are my rules. He grabbed Jackson firmly by the arm, pulling him toward the patrol car. The crowd around them closed in, whispering, shocked by the policeman's arrogance and Jackson's apparent patience. Jackson felt the tension rise in his body, but he controlled his breathing, every muscle ready to react if necessary. "You'll pay for this," he whispered almost to himself, knowing that this injustice would not go unpunished. Whitman, ignoring the threat, pushed Jackson into the car. The chains clinked as he placed them around Jackson's wrists, but he let them go without resistance, knowing that any resistance would only make his situation worse. Bystanders were taking videos with their phones, footage that would soon circulate and expose the officer's brutality. The car drove off, leaving behind the city's twilight and the worried murmur of the crowd. Jackson glanced at Whitman, his eyes fixed on the policeman's face with icy intensity. "You don't understand yet," he said softly. "You're only at the beginning of your problem." Whitman, confident in himself, focused on the road, ignoring the tension emanating from his passenger. But inside the car, Jackson was considering every option: how to report the incident, how to prove his identity, and, most importantly, how to turn this humiliation into justice. During the ride, Whitman continued to verbally provoke him, calling him a liar and an intruder, but Jackson remained silent, letting anger and humiliation transform into quiet resolve. He knew the situation would turn in his favor, but only if he kept his cool and his strategy intact. The patrol car moved slowly through the nearly deserted streets of the residential neighborhood. Jackson kept his eyes fixed on Whitman, gauging his reactions to every word and gesture. The officer seemed increasingly irritated by Jackson's imperturbable silence. "You better talk, kid," Whitman growled, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Or this is going to cost you." Jackson took a deep breath and pulled his badge from his coat, holding it prominently in front of him. "Listen to me carefully," he said in a firm but calm voice. "I am a special agent with the FBI. My name is Jackson Miller. What you are doing is illegal. You are violating my rights and abusing your power." Whitman blinked in disbelief. He paused for a few seconds, his jaw clenched, trying to hide his confusion. You're lying," he stammered, his voice betraying a mixture of anger and panic. Jackson continued, looking straight into the officer's eyes. "I can call my office. You can verify my identity immediately. Everything you do will be recorded and used against you. I advise you to release me before this situation escalates." Whitman gritted his teeth and turned slightly toward the back seat to get a better look at the badge. His face changed from arrogance to disbelief. The truth had just hit him in the face: he had arrested a federal agent, a man whose career and authority far surpassed his own. The tension in the car was palpable. Whitman tried to downplay the situation. "Well, okay, maybe I misunderstood," but his words sounded empty and forced. Jackson, motionless, knew he now had the upper hand, the law was on his side, and Whitman's racism and arrogance had just publicly betrayed him. "You have one chance to do the right thing, Whitman," Jackson said calmly. "Release me now and cooperate. Otherwise, what you did here will have severe consequences." Whitman, unable to meet Jackson's gaze, looked away. The policeman knew, deep down, that this mistake would haunt him. Jackson, meanwhile, remained in control, transforming an unjust humiliation into a silent power that would soon overturn the order of things. A few minutes after Jackson revealed his identity, a whir of sirens sounded in the distance. Whitman looked up, his face ashen, realizing he might not have grasped the full extent of the situation. Shortly after, an FBI unit, recognizable by their branded jackets and visible badges, arrived at the station. Two agents stepped out of their vehicle, determined and focused. The lead agent, Laura Reynolds, quickly approached Jackson and the police officer. "Agent Miller, you're safe now," she said firmly. She gave Whitman a stern look. "And you, Officer Whitman, stay where you are. You will cooperate." Whitman instinctively backed away, trying to keep his arrogance intact, but fear was beginning to show on his face. The station's cameras, already in the lobby, captured every gesture and every word. Jackson knew these images would play a key role. "You're abusing your authority, Whitman," Laura continued, pulling out a phone to document the scene. "You arrested a federal agent for no reason, and that's a serious violation of civil rights." Jackson, still calm, watched Whitman as he tried to downplay the incident. I thought he was suspicious," he stammered. But his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence. The tension was palpable, and all eyes were on him. The FBI unit escorted Jackson from the station. Bystanders who had witnessed the scene witnessed Whitman's dramatic descent into shame and disbelief. Jackson, despite the humiliation he had just suffered, walked with dignity, aware that justice was finally beginning to take its course. Outside, the FBI director himself arrived to assess the situation. "Whitman," he said gravely, "you will be fully investigated for abuse of power and discrimination. Your actions are unacceptable and will not go unpunished." Whitman, now completely destabilized, knew that his career had just changed. Jackson, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of relief. The injustice had been recognized, and what followed would prove that neither his badge nor his integrity could be flouted. No sooner had the incident become public than videos filmed by bystanders began circulating on social media. The footage showed Jackson Miller standing calmly, holding his badge in the face of Thomas Whitman's arrogance, while the latter attempted to restrain him with violence and ignorance. Internet users were quickly outraged. The hashtags #JusticeForJackson and #StopPoliceRacism went viral, accompanied by thousands of comments denouncing Whitman's behavior and praising Jackson's composure. Local and national newspapers picked up the story, and it soon reached national television stations. Whitman, who just hours earlier had believed himself invincible, was suddenly exposed to the national gaze. Fellow officers and even superiors began to question his methods and judgment. On talk shows and forums, civil rights experts analyzed every move and word, demonstrating that Whitman had acted out of racial prejudice and abuse of power. Jackson, for his part, remained discreet. He continued to work with the FBI to secure evidence and prepare for legal proceedings. He knew that public outrage alone would not bring justice, but it created a climate of pressure that left Whitman with no escape. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Peaceful protests began to form in front of the police station, with signs demanding "Justice for Jackson Miller" and "End Racism in Policing." Whitman, now isolated, realized that his reputation and career were crumbling. Outside, Jackson watched the crowd and the cameras, aware that this media attention was a powerful weapon. What had begun as a humiliating arrest was becoming a national symbol of resistance to racism and the abuse of power. He knew the legal battle was only just beginning, but this first victory, the public acknowledgement of injustice, marked a crucial turning point. A few days after the story broke in the media, Whitman received a summons to appear before the Police Internal Justice Court and in federal court for abuse of power and racial discrimination. The atmosphere was electric. Jackson Miller, accompanied by his FBI lawyers and civil rights experts, entered the courtroom with impressive calm, despite the humiliation he had suffered just days earlier. Whitman, for his part, seemed nervous. The flashes of the photographers and the murmur of the reporters made the situation even more oppressive. His reputation, carefully built over the years, was now tarnished, and every accusing glance in the room only increased his discomfort. The judge spoke. "We are here to examine the conduct of Officer Thomas Whitman. He is accused of arresting a federal agent, Mr. Jackson Miller, without just cause and based on racial bias." Jackson's attorney laid out the facts in detail: the videos, the bystander testimony, the internal evidence from the station, and Whitman's behavior that evening. Every detail showed that the officer had abused his authority and tried to minimize his actions to a federal superior. Whitman tried to defend himself, stammering that he thought he was doing the right thing, and that he had been deceived by appearances. But his defense seemed ridiculous in the face of the clear evidence. The videos and witness statements left no room for doubt. He had acted out of racism and arrogance. The audience in the room, as well as the reporters, held their breath. Every word spoken by Jackson's lawyer echoed as a reminder that racism and abuse of power could not go unpunished. Jackson stood motionless, calmly observing Whitman, letting his dignity speak for him. At the end of the hearing, the judge declared, "Officer Whitman, your behavior is unacceptable and contrary to all professional and ethical standards. A full investigation will be conducted and severe sanctions will follow." Whitman bowed his head, aware that his career and reputation had suffered an irreversible blow. Jackson, on the other hand, left the courtroom with the satisfaction of knowing that justice had begun to triumph, and that the truth had finally been recognized. After the hearing, the story of Jackson Miller and Thomas Whitman became a central topic of discussion throughout the city. Residents, outraged by Jackson's racist arrest and humiliation, began to show their support. Groups of citizens, made up of young people and adults, gathered in front of the police station, holding signs with slogans such as "Justice Poor Jackson" and "Stop Racism in the Police." Whitman, now isolated, no longer received the same respect from his colleagues. Some police officers avoided contact with him, while others whispered behind his back, criticizing his behavior and poor decision-making. Every step he took in the city was scrutinized and judged by residents and the media. Jackson, meanwhile, continued to work with his FBI team, but he couldn't ignore the outpouring of support. Newspapers, television stations, and social media highlighted his composure, dignity, and perseverance in the face of injustice. Residents even held peaceful rallies to honor his courage and denounce systemic racism. Whitman, faced with this public pressure, began to feel the weight of his actions. His friends and colleagues had abandoned him, and he knew that every past decision, every arbitrary arrest, would now be analyzed and judged. The entire town seemed to hold him responsible, and he understood that he no longer had any moral or social support. For Jackson, this ordeal had a double meaning. He not only saw justice being done, but he also understood the role of community in the fight against racism. The residents who had mobilized had transformed personal injustice into a collective movement, demonstrating that the power of truth and dignity could triumph over arrogance and hatred. Whitman, for his part, lived every day as a prolonged humiliation. His isolation and public scorn had become a constant reminder that actions motivated by racism had inevitable and severe consequences. A few weeks later, the federal investigation into Thomas Whitman concluded. The report was unequivocal: Whitman had abused his power, violated the civil rights of a federal agent, and acted out of racial prejudice. The punishment was severe and exemplary: immediate suspension followed by permanent dismissal, and the threat of civil lawsuits hung heavily over him. The day Whitman received the official notification, he stood alone in his deserted office, his face ashen, while the police corridors whispered his name with a mixture of contempt and relief. Every colleague he passed looked away. The man once sure of his authority was now reduced to an embarrassed silence, trapped by his own mistakes and public judgment. Jackson, for his part, remained true to his dignity and professionalism. He sought neither revenge nor further humiliation. Instead, he worked to raise awareness within the police force and encourage training against racial prejudice. His composure and patience not only ensured justice prevailed, but also transformed his experience into a lesson for all: integrity and respect for human rights always trump arrogance and hatred. Whitman, publicly humiliated and deprived of his career, painfully realized that his actions had irreversible consequences. His isolation and fall were proof that law and morality cannot be flouted with impunity. Every attempt to justify his behavior was now futile. The city, the FBI, and the community had decided he had failed. For Jackson, this chapter of his life became a symbol of strength and resilience. He had confronted injustice head-on, transformed humiliation into power, and demonstrated that courage and patience are more effective than blind anger. His lesson was clear: even in the face of racism and the abuse of power, it is possible to remain in control of one's destiny and triumph with dignity. A few months after the incident, Jackson Miller was invited to an official ceremony organized by the FBI and the city of Chicago to honor his courage and integrity. The room was filled with colleagues, government officials, citizens, and the media. The attentive and admiring faces of all present were a testament to the impact his experience had on the community and the fight against institutional racism. The FBI director took the stage, his gaze serious but respectful. "Today, we honor an agent who demonstrated exemplary patience, courage, and professionalism in the face of blatant injustice. Jackson Miller demonstrated that integrity and dignity are the most powerful forces against racism and the abuse of power. Jackson, standing on stage, felt a mixture of pride and humility. Applause echoed throughout the room, and he knew that his personal battle had transcended his own experience. He had inspired not only his colleagues, but also the city and the country. Numerous national media outlets covered the event. Newspapers, television stations, and social media outlets picked up the story, highlighting not only the humiliation he had suffered, but also how he had transformed the experience into an example of resilience and justice. Civil rights organizations sent messages of support and invited Jackson to share his experience at conferences and public forums. Whitman, meanwhile, watched the ceremony from afar through the media. Every image and every word spoken about Jackson reminded him of his failure and the irreversibility of his actions. Jackson's recognition was living proof that courage and integrity always overcome arrogance and ignorance. For Jackson, this recognition was not only a personal honor, but a clear message: racism and abuse of power never go unpunished when truth and justice prevail. His career and reputation, intact and strengthened, now served as an example to all those who must confront injustice in their lives. A few months later, Thomas Whitman was experiencing a reality he could never have imagined. His name, once respected in certain local police circles, was now associated with arrogance, racism, and abuse of power. His attempts to resume a normal professional life failed every time. Few employers wanted to take the risk of hiring a man whose behavior had been publicly exposed. In the city, he had become an example of what happens when injustice and racism confront truth and the law. Every news report about Jackson Miller, every public intervention, every citizen's testimony denouncing Whitman contributed to the heavy shadow that followed the former police officer everywhere he went. Jackson, meanwhile, continued his work at the FBI with heightened respect and authority. He had transformed a profound humiliation into a national symbol of dignity and courage. His colleagues and the community now knew that he was not only a competent agent but also a model of patience and integrity in the face of injustice. The experience had left a mark on the city itself. Citizens, inspired by Jackson's courage, had begun to become more involved in initiatives against institutional racism and to support victims of abuse of power. The mobilization around this case had created a quiet but powerful movement for justice and equality. For Whitman, every day was a reminder of his mistakes. The fall of his career and the public exposure of his actions reminded him that no authority was above justice. For Jackson, every action and word since that fateful evening demonstrated that dignity and truth could triumph over injustice, even in the darkest moments. The story of the humiliating arrest of a black FBI agent and the downfall of the racist police officer became an enduring symbol. It showed that courage, patience, and justice could transform a disastrous situation into a triumph for truth and integrity. Jackson Miller had paid the price of humiliation with perseverance and honor, and Whitman had paid the price of arrogance and racism, for the rest of his life.